The following podcast contains discussions of murder, suicide, drug use, gay subtext, and actual gay text. Also, spoilers. Lots of spoilers. Ready? Let's dig in. He always comes back to the scene of the crime. He likes to see the way it changes with every day, with every pleasure and every sin. Like a diary of corruption. Look, a wrinkle here, a blemish there. The cheeks hollow, the hair thins. He watches as it becomes more and more grotesque. It terrifies and delights him to witness how evil ravishes the soul. After all, it is his soul. I'm Gabby, and this is Digestibles, a podcast about all the books you were told to read but probably didn't. And today, we are going to talk about The Picture of Dorian Gray. But first, let's deal with the elephant in the room. Paige. Not that it's any problem, but just a heads up that the three main characters in this are gay, or at least very bi. Yes, especially Dorian. And if you don't believe me, all you need to do is look at the book's publication history. See, there are three versions of this story. The widely available and, shall we say, author-approved cut, released in 1891, the edited novella, published in 1890, and finally, the original uncensored manuscript, which you can find in the 2011 Harvard University Press edition. Or, alternatively, we can call them gay, gayer, and gayest. A little backstory on that, Oscar Wilde is commissioned to write a story for a magazine. 9 months later, the editor finds it too scandalous to print and edits it to make it more, acceptable. But he does it without telling Wilde. And worse, it doesn't really help. Critics would call the work vulgar, unclean, and poisonous. And then a year later, Wilde publishes an improved, self-censored version. He adds character development, expands it from 13 chapters to 20, and writes a witty preface to clap back against the critics. With each edit, there's less homoerotic tension and more room for denial. Wilde was gay himself. It was an open secret, but homosexuality was illegal. And you could see how writing a book about obvious man love would be a confirmation of sorts. True enough, barely 5 years after it's published, Wilde is tried and convicted of gross indecency. He spends 2 years in prison, and once released, he immediately goes to France and never returns. And on that happy note, let's see what all the fuss is about. I'm gonna use the 1891 version, and like I said, we start with a preface from Wilde saying, "Hey guys, sometimes art doesn't have to have morals. Sometimes it just has to be pretty. Duly noted, sir." Cut to an artist's studio. The artist, Basil Hallward, is checking out his current work, a portrait of a beautiful young man. His companion, Lord Henry, comments that it's his best work and he should show it to the world. And Basil's like, "No, I've put too much of myself in it." Lord Henry laughs. "No offense, friend, but that guy's hot and you're not." Basil didn't mean it that way. He explains that when someone paints a portrait, he doesn't really reveal the secrets of the subject, but the secrets of the artist himself. And Basil's got a lot of secret feelings about this certain subject. He tells Lord Henry that 2 months ago he was at this party. He sees Dorian Gray for the first time. Their eyes meet across a crowded room, and suddenly he feels afraid as if something terrible and wonderful is about to happen. He tries to leave but finds himself face to face with a young man. Later, Dorian would tell him that it was destiny for them to meet. Aw. Although, considering how this story goes, I kinda take that back. Anyway, soon after they're BFFs and Basil needs to see him every day or else he can't be happy. Lord Henry asks, "What about your art?" And Basil replies, "Dorian is all my art to me now." Yep. Sounds like a couple to me. A couple of besties? Hey. Anyway, sorry. Yeah, totally just besties. Lord Henry is now curious, which is a problem because he's not exactly a nice guy. Sure, he's charming and witty, but he's not nice. He wants to meet this Dorian, but Basil doesn't want to introduce them. He's scared that Henry's not niceness would rub off on Dorian, who's as pure inside as he is on the outside. Lord Henry's like, sure, okay. Same, bro. Enter the topic of the portrait and conversation. The butler announces Dorian's arrival. Basil begs Lord Henry not to be a bad influence to his friend. Lord Henry just laughs. Basil has no choice but to introduce Dorian to Lord Henry. Dorian certainly looks like an angel, all pouty red lips, innocent blue eyes, and golden hair. No wonder Basil's super crushing on him. Dorian likes Lord Henry immediately, and Basil jokes that Dorian shouldn't listen to anything Lord Henry says. Dorian poses while Basil finishes his painting. Henry watches and argues that all influence is bad influence. The influencee becomes an echo or a copy of the influencer and can never self-actualize on his own. Yeah, remember when I said that Lord Henry isn't nice? He thinks that influencing is immoral but doesn't really care that he's doing it to Dorian. He's actually doing it on purpose. Boo! Boo, you whore! Kidding, sorry, Mean Girls reference. He continues to explain his philosophy. Everyone should just give in to the dark side and live their lives as they want to. Hashtag YOLO, anyone? Hashtag come over to the dark side, we have cookies? Yeah. Anyway, Dorian is totally attracted to it, and Basil's too busy working to notice his friend being seduced by the darkness. Dorian asks for a break and goes to the garden. He buries his face in some lilacs to calm himself down. Lord Henry follows and is all, cool, aromatherapy. I'm down with that. He's down with everything that pleases the senses. He also tells Dorian that youth and beauty are the only things in the world worth having, and that he should enjoy his while he can. Dorian ponders this advice with some terror. Basil suddenly calls them back to the studio. Dorian models again, and after a while, Basil's done. Henry calls Dorian over to admire the portrait. Dorian stares as if seeing himself for the first time. Who's that cutie in the painting? That's me? And then he remembers Lord Henry's words and starts to tear up. Basil is surprised. What's wrong with the painting?
How sad it is! Murmured Dorian Gray with his eyes still fixed upon his own portrait. I shall grow old and horrible and dreadful, but this picture will remain always young. It will never be older than this particular day of June. If it were only the other way! If it were I who was to always be young, and the picture that was to grow old, for that, I would give everything! Yes, there is nothing in the whole world I would not give! I would give my soul for that!
Okay, so Dorian is on total drama queen mode now, threatening to kill himself when he grows old. And Basil's like, really, Henry? He was with you for 2 minutes! All Henry can do is shrug. They argue a bit until Basil can't even handle this anymore. He offers to just destroy the painting. He grabs a knife and Dorian snaps out of it and tells him not to. Everything settles down and they drink tea like the proper English gentlemen they are. Henry invites everyone to the theater. Dorian's game, but Basil wants to stay home with the real Dorian, aka the one in the painting. He begs Dorian not to go with Henry, but Dorian really wants to go. So they leave and Basil flings himself dramatically onto a sofa. The next day, Lord Henry visits his Uncle George, who is a bit of a gossip, and Henry needs to know everything about his new boy toy. He finds out that Dorian is the grandson of a lord. His mother was a very beautiful lady who fell in love with a commoner, and rumor has it that Dorian's grandfather had his son-in-law killed in a duel. But the good news is Dorian will be rich when he inherits his grandfather's fortune. Next on Lord Henry's schedule is his Aunt Agatha's house. Apparently he's late for lunch, but he charms everyone anyway, including Dorian, who is a guest. One of the other guests says that Lord Henry's too witty. Why doesn't he write a book? Henry says England prefers their newspapers and encyclopedias. They're not ready for all of this. So Lord Henry starts to leave and Dorian wants to go with him. Lord Henry asks, "Aren't you supposed to meet up with Basil?" To which Dorian replies, "Yes, but I can totally ditch him. All I want to do is listen to you talk." A month later, Dorian is visiting Lord Henry's house. He meets Henry's wife, Victoria, who's shallow and a bit of a tryhard. I'm going to warn you now not to expect anything from the women in this book. They're mostly ridiculous, sadly, and Lord Henry hates them. He quips that Dorian should never marry because he'll only end up disappointed. And Dorian's like, "Oh, did I forget to tell you? I'm in love." With whom? A beautiful actress named Sybil Vane. Henry's like, "Really, Dorian, an actress? Ugh, how common." "But she's different," defends Dorian. He's been wandering the slums when he stumbled on a cheap London theater playing Romeo and Juliet. Everyone is dreadful except for Sybil, who's a genius even though she's only 17. The manager asks Dorian if he'd like to come meet her backstage and he declines. But he keeps coming back to watch her perform. After the third night, he feels he's ready to meet her. Sybil is shy and gentle, almost childlike with innocence. She's smitten with Dorian and calls him Prince Charming. Oh, poor girl. Sis, you in a horror story, not a fairy tale. Dorian wants Basil and Henry to come with him one night and see Sybil act. Oh, and speaking of Basil, he sent Dorian that portrait, but Dorian's been ghosting him because he's becoming annoying. So, Dorian leaves and Henry reflects on how his experiment on Dorian is working and how fascinating human nature is. He goes out to dinner and when he returns, he finds a telegram from Dorian. He and Sybil are engaged. Next, we meet Sybil and her mother. Sybil is totally in love and, like every teenager, is being absolutely irritating about it. I mean, okay, I guess she's just super happy. But she's also super naive, and her mom seems to think so too. Mrs. Vane goes, "You're only 17, you don't know anything." And Sybil's like, "Geez, Mom, let me live." Yeah, no, you know when Ariel in The Little Mermaid was like, "Daddy, I'm 16, I'm not a child anymore." Girl, you are. And so is Sybil. Sybil's brother James enters the room. He's 16, clumsy and thick, the opposite of his sister. He invites her out for a walk as he's leaving for Australia soon in search of his own fortune. They go to the park and while Sybil is talking, he worries about her fiancé. Unlike Sybil, he's less optimistic about Prince Charming. He warns her to beware of him, but of course Sybil doesn't listen. And it just so happens that Dorian drives by the park in a carriage. James tries to catch a glimpse, but he's too far away. He tells Sybil that if her prince ever hurts her, he'll kill him. And Sybil's horrified, but reminds him that he wouldn't hurt someone she loves, right? And she's gonna love Dorian forever. Yeah, right. So, they return home and say their goodbyes. James goes to talk to his mother and finds out they're illegitimate. His father was a gentleman who wouldn't marry her and left them poor. James repeats his words to his mom, saying if Sybil gets hurt, he'll come back to kill her fiancé. This, of course, makes Mrs. Vane happy because, ooh, she just loves the drama. In the meantime, Basil and Henry are discussing Dorian's sudden engagement. Basil doesn't approve while Henry's just waiting to bring out the popcorn. Dorian arrives and tells the story of how he got engaged. He was watching Sybil perform as Rosalind in As You Like It and was so overwhelmed with love, he rushes backstage after to propose. And just to provide a bit of context, Rosalind is one of Shakespeare's famous cross-dressing heroines. Just in case anyone is still in denial about how gay this is. Not that there's anything wrong with that, again. I personally love this. Anyway, the engagement needs to remain a secret as Dorian's guardian won't approve. Basil sees that Dorian is really in love, so I guess he's okay with it now. Henry's still cynical about it though. He starts to rant about women and Dorian laughs it off. He'll change his mind when he meets Sybil. And, oh, by the way, Sybil is making him forget all about Henry's dangerous philosophy. They separate and Basil is sad about the fact that marriage will most likely change his, friendship with Dorian. Later, they meet at the theater to watch Sybil. She's playing Juliet just like that first time Dorian saw her. Except this time, She is terrible, so absolutely terrible that Dorian's embarrassed. Henry gets up to leave at the intermission. He says Sybil can't act. Basil thinks she might be sick and that's why she's having a bad night. Dorian cannot believe it. He can't get why she's being so mediocre. Henry's like, well, she's gorgeous, what else matters? Dorian stays for the rest of the disaster and rushes backstage after. He confronts Sybil about her lack of talent and she's confused. Don't you understand? Before she fell in love with him, everything was acting. Now that she has the real thing, she can't bear to perform the fake thing. Dorian flings himself dramatically onto a sofa. Well, good luck with that. You've just killed my love for you. Sybil laughs, thinking it's just a joke. Dorian shouts that he loved her genius, and now she's just shallow and stupid and a third-rate actress with a pretty face. Yikes. Ouch, Dorian. Low blow. Like a really low blow. Dorian leaves saying he never wants to see her again. And he wanders around London, not really knowing where he's going. He returns home at dawn. He sees his portrait and notices something weird about it. He shrugs it off and goes back to his room, but it's still bothering him. He goes back to examine the picture.
In the dim-arrested light that struggled through the cream-colored silk blinds, the face appeared to him to be a little changed. The expression looked different. One would have said that there was a touch of cruelty in the mouth. It was certainly strange. He turned round and, walking to the window, drew up the blind. The bright dawn flooded the room and swept the fantastic shadows into dusky corners, where they lay shuddering. But the strange expression that he had noticed in the face of the portrait seemed to linger there, to be more intensified even. The quivering, ardent sunlight showed him the lines of cruelty round the mouth as clearly as if he had been looking into a mirror after he had done some dreadful thing.
Wincing at the change, he looks at a mirror and can't see any lines marring his face. What does it mean, he wonders. He remembers the wish he made in Basil's studio. Could it have come true? Was this the effect of his cruelty to Sybil? It pricks his conscience, so he promises to stop seeing Lord Henry and go to Sybil, apologize and marry her. Yes, if he loves her again, then everything will be okay. He covers the painting just in case. Dorian wakes up in the afternoon and does his usual routine, gets dressed, eats breakfast, but he doesn't open his mail. Then he tells the servants that he's not at home to visitors and then locks himself in his room to look at the portrait again. It really has changed. He sits down to write a long, passionate letter to Sybil asking for forgiveness. Suddenly, a knock. Lord Henry has come to call. He's worried about Dorian because of the Sybil thing. Dorian announces he's going to marry her and Henry is shocked. Didn't Dorian get his letter? Sybil is dead by suspected suicide. It seems she drank some kind of poison in her dressing room. Everything is not okay. Dorian begins to panic. Not really out of concern, but more like, yeah, okay, that sucks, but what about me? He asks Henry why he can't feel bad about it. It's not like he's heartless. But they talk about her death like it's the perfect ending to a tragic play. Lord Henry even wishes someone had loved him enough to kill themselves over him. It makes Sybil special. Wow, there are really no words for this dude. Lord Henry advises him not to get mixed up in it too much and come with him to the opera tonight. Dorian agrees. When Henry leaves, Dorian looks at his portrait again. It seems his life has taken a turn and he's ready to embrace it. It doesn't matter what happens to the painting. As long as he remains pretty on the outside, he's fine. He covers it and smiles. An hour later, he's at the opera with Lord Henry. Next morning at breakfast, it's Basil's turn to visit. He read about Sybil's death and assumes Dorian is heartbroken. Joke's on you, he's not. In fact, he'd rather talk about the opera. Basil is horrified at his friend's behavior. Dorian's all, what's past is past. And Basil claps back, you call yesterday the past? Once again, Dorian detaches himself from the situation and talks about Sybil like she's just a character in a play. Basil is sad that his friend is starting to sound a lot like Lord Henry. Also, apparently, Dorian never even told Sybil his full name, so that means the police won't come calling. What a... Dorian asks Basil if he can do a drawing of Sybil so he'll have something to remember her by. Basil agrees and asks Dorian to model for him again. Dorian refuses. Basil tries to take the covering off the painting, but Dorian stops him. He tells him that their friendship is over if he touches it. Basil says he wants to exhibit it. Dorian freaks out. What changed his mind? Basil goes on a long speech about how he's so obsessed with Dorian, but it's all for the art. Yeah, sure. When he leaves, Dorian thinks well about everything. He calls for his servants and arranges for someone to come and help move the painting to another room. He peeks on it again and notes that it's uglier than ever. He wonders, maybe it doesn't have to grow old and awful. Maybe he can change. Nah, too much effort. So he chooses a dusty old schoolroom at the top floor of his house for the painting's new home. He asks the housekeeper for the key and locks the room. After, he settles down in his study with a book that Lord Henry just sent him. It comes with a newspaper clipping of Sybil's death. But Dorian doesn't want to deal with the ugly things in life anymore. The book is worn like it's been read repeatedly, and it's covered with yellow paper. It's a strange book about a young Parisian who devotes his life to all the vice and virtues of every century except his own. Dorian is so absorbed with it that he's late for dinner with Lord Henry. You know the kind of book that just changes your life? Well, this was the book for Dorian. He's fascinated by it and relates so much with the book's hero, he buys multiple copies and has them bound in different colors so that they can match his mood. So, time passes and Dorian becomes a society darling. He throws parties, gets with the in crowd, and hangs out with Lord Henry a lot. But rumors also circulate about his behavior. Rumors that most people don't believe because he still looks so angelic. Dorian devotes himself to discovering more pleasures and ideas. He also buys a lot of stuff. No, really, there are paragraphs and paragraphs about all the things, art, jewels, perfume, all these things that he collected over the years. I mean, I get it. I can spend hours talking about my crystal collection, and, well, it's a huge collection, I can tell you that. Dorian is also way too obsessed with his painting. Like, he looks at it all the time to see how it changes, and even brings a mirror so that he can compare it to a still perfect face. He is also super duper paranoid that someone will discover his secret. His paranoia traps him. Like he can't bear to be away from his house for so long. Society begins to notice that he's a little bit weird. But this only makes him more mysteriously fascinating to them. Just a little side note, the book that supposedly poisons Dorian's mind is hinted to be À la Bourse, or Against Nature by J.K. Huysmans, a major influence in the aesthetic movement which Oscar Wilde supported that emphasizes style over substance. Moving on. One foggy night on Dorian's 38th birthday, he runs into Basil on the street. He pretends not to see him, but Basil calls him out. Dude, it's me? You know, your bestie who's kinda obsessed with you? Don't you remember? Not so fun fact, Wilde changed Dorian's age here. In the manuscript and magazine versions, Dorian is 32. The same age as Wilde when he wrote it. Probably so that people wouldn't confuse him with his character. But again, it didn't really help. Basil walks Dorian home. He's glad he bumped into him because he's leaving tonight for Paris and he won't return until he paints a masterpiece. Dorian tries to get him to leave, but Basil has something to say. It's a one-man intervention. Basil's heard a lot of stuff from the grapevine, and none of them good. He lists a bunch of people that Dorian supposedly ruined. Men who've died or left England or talk behind his back or leave the room whenever Dorian enters. He even ruined Lord Henry's sister. Yikes, that is against the bro code, dude. Dorian brushes him off. It's not his fault he brings out the worst in people. He's only revealing their truth or some excuse. Basil continues, how can someone so beautiful be so awful? He wishes he could see Dorian's soul, but only God can do that. Dorian laughs. Wanna see my soul? Sure, I'll show you my soul tonight. He gets almost insanely excited. Basil follows Dorian to a locked room. Dorian asks again, "You really sure you want to see it?" "Yes," Basil answers. Yikes. Dorian leads him into the dusty old room and brings him to the covered painting. He flings off the curtain and Basil's immediately horrified. It's Dorian, but not Dorian? He looks at the aging man in the picture and looks back at his friend who's still young and beautiful. Dorian reminds him about that long-ago wish he had made in Basil's studio. Basil just can't get his head around it. But if this is Dorian's soul, then he must be as evil as the whispers say he is. Basil tells Dorian he must pray for forgiveness, and Dorian's eyes get teary. He looks at the painting. It's too late. Then all of a sudden, Dorian grabs a knife and stabs his friend.
There was a stifled groan and the horrible sound of someone choking with blood. 3 times the outstretched arms shot up convulsively, waving grotesque, stiff-fingered hands in the air. He stabbed him twice more, but the man did not move. Something began to trickle on the floor. He waited for a moment, still pressing the head down. Then he threw the knife on the table and listened. He could hear nothing but the drip-drip on the threadbare carpet. He opened the door and went out on the landing. The house was absolutely quiet. No one was about. For a few seconds, he stood bending over the balustrade and peering down into the black seething well of darkness. Then he took out the key and returned to the room, locking himself in as he did so.
Hey, how do you know you're evil? Well, if you manage to brutally murder your friend and remain eerily calm afterwards, that's definitely one sign. In fact, Dorian's more worried about how to get rid of the body and not get caught. And, ooh, look at that pretty lamp. Sorry, attention span. Okay, so you know how Tolkien likes to describe trees and George R.R. Martin likes to describe food? Apparently, Oscar Wilde likes to describe lamps and rugs and home decorations. Pretty interesting. You do you, Oscar. Right, back to the murder. It's a good thing Basil was planning to go to Paris, so no one's gonna miss him for a while. Dorian sneaks out of his house and pretends that he forgot his key so that he'll have an alibi. The next day, Dorian summons an ex-friend, and he's got a lot of those. It's a scientist called Alan Campbell, and they used to be inseparable. Alan comes reluctantly, and no, he doesn't want to help Dorian get rid of a body. Dorian begs him for the sake of their friendship, and when this doesn't work, he resorts to blackmail. He shows Alan a letter he's written, and it must be so horrible because Alan eventually agrees to science the body away. Alan sends for the chemicals he needs, and Dorian goes up to the schoolroom in advance. He sees that the painting is uncovered. Oh no, he forgot. But as he moves to hide it, he notices that one of his hands in the painting is sweating blood. Interesting. When Alan has his stuff, Dorian leaves him alone to do his thing. And when Alan emerges, he's like, I never want to see you ever again. Later, Dorian's at a party. He's both bored and anxious, and even Lord Henry can't amuse him. Lord Henry's all, okay, tell me about last night. But Dorian snaps at him and becomes defensive, and Henry's just like, dude, what? Dorian makes an excuse and heads home. He sulks in his library and watches while he burns Basil's coat and bag in his fireplace. Then he grabs a small Chinese box with some opium. If you don't know what opium is, think of it like the mother of heroin, or the weed of the upper-class Victorian society. It's almost midnight by the time Dorian sneaks out of his house again, dressed in plain clothes. He hires a cab to take him to a faraway location. It's the sketchy part of town where all the opium dens are. They're dirty and shabby and filled with addicts. He bumps into another one of his former friends, a young man called Adrian Singleton. Dorian's disgusted by how low Adrian has become. Never mind that it's his fault. He tries to leave, but a beggar woman insults him and calls him Prince Charming. Dorian throws money at her to try to make her go away. In the background, a sailor overhears the exchange and follows Dorian while he walks down the street. He grabs him and holds a gun to his face. Uh-oh. It's James Vane, Sybil's brother. He's been looking for Dorian for years so that he can have his revenge. Of course, he doesn't know Dorian's name. He just knows that he's called Prince Charming. Dorian denies knowing Sybil. He asks James how long it's been since her death, and James says 18 years. 18 years! What? Dorian orders James to look at him, and James is horrified. He was just about to murder an innocent 20-year-old. Innocent. Sure. Later, the beggar woman finds James and tells him he should have killed Dorian. James goes, well, that guy was too young. The woman laughs and says that Dorian's been young for about 18 years. It's almost like he sold his soul to the devil for eternal youth or something. James hurries to find Dorian, but he's long gone. A week later, Dorian is hosting a house party in the country. They're flirting, drinking tea, and being all witty and fabulous when Dorian suddenly groans and collapses. Dorian leaves his friends, and we discover the reason that he faints is because he sees James Vane watching him from outside the window. The next day, Dorian doesn't leave the house. He's paranoid that James will manage to kill him. Part of him hopes that James was just a hallucination. After a couple of days, he emerges as if nothing happened. He goes out hunting with his friends and sees a beautiful hare. He tells his companions not to shoot at it. One of them scoffs, shoots at it anyway, and accidentally hits a servant. Nice. Dorian thinks this is bad luck and something awful is about to happen to someone. To him in particular. In the meantime, his friends are unaffected by the fact that they had just killed a person. Great crowd you're surrounding yourself with, man. Later, Dorian asks his servants about the guy who died, but nobody can tell him who he is. Dorian rushes to look at the body. It's James Vane. Suddenly, Dorian feels relieved because this means he's finally safe. Weeks pass and Dorian wants to turn over a new leaf. Henry doesn't think he can, though. He's like, Dorian, dear boy, to me, you are perfect. Dorian is really serious this time, though. He's spending more time in the country. It's easy to resist temptation out there. And like this one time, he meets a girl who reminds him of Sybil and they fall in love, but he leaves her alone because he's totally a good person now. Henry just mocks him. Dorian changes the topic. He wants to know all about the town gossip. Henry says, well, Basil's still missing and some guy named Alan killed himself, but let's talk about me. Dorian asks if Henry thinks Basil was murdered. Henry's like, Basil's too boring to get murdered. But what if I killed Basil? Dorian confesses. Henry's like, dude, what are you talking about? We're too fabulous to do something as silly as murder. We leave that to the lower classes. And the topic shifts again. This time they're talking about souls, and Lord Henry wonders what it would be like to sell one. Dorian knows, but he's not gonna tell. Henry praises Dorian again and says that the way he has lived his life is art, and he mustn't spoil it by being something as dull as a good person. And Dorian goes, well, it was your book that corrupted me. You really shouldn't show it to anyone else. Henry rejects that idea because art can't influence someone's actions. Wow, you sure about that, Henry? That night, Dorian can't bear to look at his beautiful face in the mirror. He smashes it to pieces and then goes up to the schoolroom to look at his portrait again. He's hoping that the thing with the innocent country maiden would reflect on it, but nope, it's still as ugly as ever. And now there's a look in his eyes. Sort of like a hypocrite who's happy to get away with his lies. Dorian realizes that he was just pretending to be good and not actually being it. Maybe he should just confess. But, how unfair that this one murder is going to follow him for the rest of his life. The painting now looks to him like his conscience trying to guilt him into being a better person. Furious, he decides to destroy it because without it, he'd be free. Without it, he'd finally have some peace. So what he does is this. He grabs a knife. Yes, the same one he used to kill Basil, and stabs the picture with it.
There was a cry heard and a crash. The cry was so horrible in its agony that the frightened servants woke and crept out of their rooms. After about a quarter of an hour, they knocked, but there was no reply. They called out. Everything was still. Finally, After vainly trying to force the door, they got on the roof and dropped down onto the balcony. The windows yielded easily, their bolts were old. When they entered, they found hanging upon the wall a splendid portrait of their master as they had last seen him, in all the wonder of his exquisite youth and beauty. Lying on the floor was a dead man in evening dress with a knife in his heart. He was withered, wrinkled, and loathsome of visage. It was not till they had examined the rings that they had recognized who it was.
What would you give to be young and beautiful forever? Dorian certainly thought that it was worth his soul. And it's not just him. The world is still as obsessed with finding any so-called fountain of youth. With skincare routines, fad diets, plastic surgery, Photoshop, and face tuning, the business of beauty is a billion-dollar industry. It may not cost you your soul, but it will cost a buttload of money. Unless, of course, you need to sell that soul for a buttload of money. And just saying. But we do have an advantage. Something that didn't exist in Victorian England. The greatest tool of the 21st century. Hot Pockets. Just kidding. It's social media. With Instagram especially, we don't need a Basil in our lives to paint us a portrait. Now, I'm not saying we're all monsters behind the curtain like Dorian, but you have to admit that we like to present ourselves better online. It's just human nature. Then there's the rise of influencer culture. How this obsession with selling youth and beauty and happiness in perfect little squares often leads to envy, narcissism, loneliness, depression, and social anxiety. Kinda terrible, but sadly, that's the world we live in now. As Lord Henry put it, there is no such thing as a good influence, Mr. Grey. All influence is immoral. Wouldn't you agree? And that's what we got for this week. Thank you so much for listening. I hope I made the picture of Dorian Gray a little bit easier for you to digest. Anyway, I'm Gabby, and you can find me at Gabby Pasquavox on Instagram and Twitter, or you can use the hashtag Digestibles Podcast. Please do tell me what you thought of this episode. Special thanks to Thor for providing the narrations and to Jazz for composing our theme music. And there we have it. I hope to see you next week in our next episode. Stay tuned for that. See ya! Bye! Digestibles is part of Connect, a podcast network, bringing together entertaining stories to spark your imagination. For more awesome content, follow us on social media at Connect Podcasts. Connect Podcasts. Connect Podcasts. Connect Podcasts. Connect Podcasts.